Hi everyone, I'm Kavisshnu, part of the AJ called Malaysia Asian Parliamentary. The purpose of this recording is to brief you guys on the types of motions that you're going to encounter at the tournament this weekend and the things that you should keep in mind when debating them. The first type of motion we'll go through is policy motions. In motions such as these, government teams are expected to define and explain how the action or the policy is going to be carried out. And this process is what we call modeling. So opposition teams aren't required to provide a counter model, but they can provide an alternative policy to challenge the government team's model as long as it is mutually exclusive with the ways in which the government team is going to execute this. So, in the motion, this House would ban smoking. It is useful and expected for the government team to explain the methods by which they are going to ban smoking. For example, they could gradually increase the taxation on cigarettes, or they could phase out the ability for people to purchase cigarettes within a certain period of time. Opposition may argue for a counter policy in which they don't outright ban smoking, but rather regulate the sale of tobacco or restrict the ability for people below a certain age to purchase cigarettes. It's also important to note that government teams have some leeway to exclude extreme cases. So, for example, in the motion, this House would ban plastic surgery. The government team may still allow plastic surgery for individuals who need it for critical medical purposes, but have a blanket ban on the ability for people to access plastic surgery for cosmetic reasons, for example. Okay, so some policy motions will explicitly state what the opposition comparative is. If this were to be the case, then opposition teams are not allowed to introduce counter policies or alternative models that contradict or do not align with what the motion expects them to defend. So, if the wording of the motion were to be, this House would require all non-violent criminals to perform community service instead of going to prison, opposition teams must defend sending all non-violent criminals to prison. They cannot introduce an alternate policy, such as forcing them to attend rehab, because the motion doesn't give them the liberty to do so. They have to defend what the counterfactual the motion provides is. Lastly, in discussing policy motions, it's important to understand the concept of fiat. Fiat is essentially the ability for government teams to assume that the policy, as stipulated in the motion, will pass. This means that it is not a valid line of response from the opposition team to argue that this policy is not going to make it out of parliament and it is going to be shut down before it gets implemented from the get-go. Likewise, if government has a level of fiat to institute a certain change or implement a certain policy, opposition teams also have equal fiat on the other side of a this house would debate, i.e. a policy debate. So if government is going to assume the access to a certain amount of resources to institute their policy, the counter policy and the counter model that opposition is going to institute has to match that same level of capacity and resources. So, in the motion, this House believes that Russia should make a credible public offer to the United States for joint decommissioning of their entire nuclear arsenal. The government team can assume and have fiat to assume that Russia will make the offer because the motion expects them to defend that. But the fiat power does not extend to assuming that other stakeholders are going to behave in ways that align with the policy. So it is a perfectly valid line of response for opposition to say that even if Russia makes the offer, the US will not accept it. They can also argue that other individuals and actors and stakeholders that are going to be affected by this policy are going to challenge Russia on this, and the policy itself may not be implemented in a perfect way, but the fiat of the government team prevents them from making the claim that the policy will not pass from the get-go. The second type of motions we're going to look at are value judgment motions. And these are usually phrased as this house supports X, this house opposes X, or this house believes that X. In value judgment debates, the government teams are required to argue for the truth of the statement represented by X, while the opposition teams have to do the opposite, which is argue that the statement represented by X is false. In motions such as these, government teams are not required to have a model as they would be required in a policy motion, for example, but they can provide certain definitions if there is some level of ambiguity in the statement itself. So, in the motion, this House believes that Trump's policies have done more harm than good. Debaters are expected to recognize that Trump's policies have some benefits and some harms, and then argue on balance whether it was his policies are more beneficial, which is the government team's burden, therefore proving the truth of the statement, or whether or not his policies are more harmful than they are beneficial. So proving that the statement itself is false and fulfilling the opposition team's burden. Okay, value judgment motions can also be phrased as this house prefers X or this house prefers X over Y. So motions such as these function the same way as any other value judgment motions. However, opposition teams are bound to specific comparisons represented by Y, or in the instance where there is no Y stipulated in the motion, they have to defend status quo. So in the motion, this house prefers a benevolent dictatorship over a weak democracy. The government team is bound to defend benevolent dictatorships, while the opposition team must argue in favor of weak democracies. If the motion were to just be, for example, this house prefers benevolent dictatorships without explicitly stating a counterfactual that the opposition teams have to defend, then opposition has to defend status quo. So whatever the form of government within the context of the debate is, has to be the counterfactual that opposition teams defend. The third type of motion we'll go through are actor motions, and they are usually phrased as this house as X, or this house believes that it is in the interest of X to do Y. In these motions, teams are expected to debate from the perspective of a certain actor, and who these actors are may range from individual people to entire institutions or social movements. So teams, when debating these motions, should consider what the actor's knowledge, values, experience, and interests are, and explain why the motion is either in the favor of the actor, which is what the government team is expected to do, or not in the interests of the actor, which is the opposition team's burden. It's important to note here that the interests of the actor may not always align with normative interests. So you and I, on a value judgment, may think that solving poverty or solving world hunger is a good thing, but it's up to the teams to prove that actors do or do not care about these normative goods and normative interests that other people may take for granted. So on the motion, this house believes that it is in the interest of Donald Trump to condemn DOGE, or the Department of Governmental Efficiency. It is important for teams to analyze the interests and incentives of Donald Trump and whether or not condemning DOGE would bring benefits to Donald Trump. So perhaps a team could argue that condemning DOGE would mean that the American people may experience certain benefits. But this line of argumentation cannot be credited to its fullest extent unless teams do the additional legwork to show why benefiting the American people is in the interest of Donald Trump. Okay, the next type of motion we'll go through are retrospective motions, and they're usually phrased as this house regrets X. So the example we have for you guys here is this house regrets the Belt and Road Initiative. In these motions, government must argue that the absence of X would have been good for the world. So both teams have the benefit of hindsight in these debates, and teams are expected to evaluate the harms of benefits that have happened as a result of X, but also to conceptualize a world in which X never happened or never existed. What is the likely, branching out of history going to look like, and evaluate the possible harms and benefits of this alternate world as well, which is why government teams should also provide a counterfactual which illustrates what this looks like. So within the context of this motion, absent of the Belt and Road Initiative, the US would have taken a more decisive, more active interest in providing foreign aid to these regions, for example, or that alternative financial institutions that aren't solely under the control of China likely would have propped up as well. It's important to note that retrospective motions can also be phrased as this house prefers a world in which X. In motions such as these, teams are they have the same burden as they would in a This House Regrets debate, where they have to conceptualize an alternate world in which, since the dawn of time, X has been true, or the whatever X is within the motion has come to pass or hasn't. This also is a retrospective debate, which gives teams the liberty to evaluate key moments in human history and how the prevalence of X would have changed their outcomes. So, in the motion, this house prefers a world in which humans do not experience extreme emotions. Ever since the dawn of humanity, ever since humans existed, government has to defend a world where these humans have never felt extreme emotions from that point in time up until now, while opposition has to defend status quo, which is that it is a world where humans have always been able to experience extreme emotions from the inception of humanity to this point in time. The final type of motion we'll go through predicts motions, and they're usually phrased as this house predicts that X. And these type of motions are fairly new, so it's understandable if a lot of debaters are confused by them. Here are the important things that you have to know and how to debate them. This motion expects government teams to prove that X will happen, while opposition has to prove that X will not happen. Neither team has to prove whether X is a good or bad outcome. So these debates happen purely on an analysis of likelihood. In the motion, this house predicts that the US will withdraw all aid to Ukraine. Teams should not debate about whether or not the world will be a better place if the US withdraws its aid. They just have to show that given the current context of the world and the incentives of the actors and stakeholders relevant to the debate, government has to prove that it is more likely than not that the US will retract all aid, while opposition has to prove that it is more likely than not that the US will not retract and withdraw all aid that it is currently giving to Ukraine. Okay, that marks the end of the briefings, everyone. Hope that was informative. I'll see you guys at MAP this weekend.